session itself will run in terms of our guest speaker Anna will present to you a little bit about the chapter, probably for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then the second half of the session will be about you asking questions, Anna and me and Jen possibly jumping in to support that discussion, and also to get kind of input from you as an audience, as a coaching workforce, to understand kind of what your thoughts are around this myth. Just a bit of housekeeping as well. If everyone please can stay on mute. As you'll see, we've got a lot of people coming in, and we're really overwhelmed by the amount of interest. So thanks so much for joining us. And just to give you a little bit of a background to the book, Andrew Pert, who's our editor, big shout out to Andy. I think he's on the webinar tonight, and obviously a big shout out to my co-author and friend Jen Corr, who's also with us. Andy came to us in 2020 to present the idea of the myths book. So I have to give Andy credit because he's the brains behind the idea. And he came to me and Jen to ask about, you know, is it something that's viable? Is it something that coaches will be interested in? And from there, me and Jen kind of went to coaches and asked coaches what potential myths might exist, what myths they come across in their everyday kind of world. So I really want to reiterate that these chapters are really informed by coaches for coaches. They are informed by coaches and then written by practitioners, academics, pracademics, and experts from all around the world. And hopefully we've really kind of, I don't know, caused a few arguments, a few raised eyebrows, informed coaches, and hopefully cause more questions than answers as well. But saying that, there's only 20 chapters, and I'm sure you know that of other chapters that we've potentially missed, and that's something that Jen's going to come to at the end of the session in terms of, you know, what chapters do you think, or what myths do you think we could add? But hold that thought for now, because Jen's going to come to that at the end of the session. So there's 20 chapters in the book. So that's 20 webinars until November 2023. So hopefully you'll all still be with us by then. And just like in terms of the book, obviously, if you haven't bought the book already, please be aware that it is available to buy via Amazon or Waterstones. Amazon currently have a 27% discount. And Andy at Sequire, the publisher, has given a 25% discount with the code LEARN. So that's available for everyone who's attended this webinar tonight. If also you want to bulk buy, so if we've got any national governing bodies here or any organisations looking to share the book with their workforce, there is a 40% discount for anyone who wants to purchase more than 40 books. So do bear that in mind and do contact Andy directly. In terms of, we've talked about housekeeping, formatting of the session. So without further ado, I want to pass on to Anna Stodter. Anna has wrote our learning styles chapter, which is chapter 6 in the book. Just a little bit about Anna. I've already mentioned we've got world-class authors. Anna is primarily a senior lecturer in sport coaching at Anglia Ruskin. She is an academic and a very good one, but she's also a coach. She has been a previous elite athlete. So we're really thrilled to have like all Anna's different perspectives to be able to contribute to this book. So Anna, I'm gonna I'll let you kind of share your slides, and while you do that, I just want to ask the audience if you can pop in the chat, when was the last time that learning styles was discussed, or you came across kind of learning styles within your coaching role, within coach education? Because obviously it's something that's still quite prominent within coaching, but we'd really like to know if it's something that you still see within your kind of your environment. Thanks, Anna. I'll hand over to you.
Very nice, thank you. Can you see those slides okay? Am I showing the right thing? Right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So the first, hopefully not the least. If you enjoy tonight, then please do come along to the future webinars. If you don't enjoy tonight, please still come along to the future webinars because they'll be with different people. There's some great chapters in this book. I very much enjoyed reading some of the other chapters, and as Amy said, there's some brilliant people that wrote these too. So yeah, hopefully this is the start of a really exciting and engaging kind of series of webinars, and a great chance to ask questions about the things that you've been wondering if it's okay to ask about. I thought I'd start maybe with a little bit of, well, I'd like you perhaps, if you're a coach, or maybe a coach developer, just have a little think to yourself now about, consider how you learned to coach, or how you learned to do what you do in your day-to-day life. And perhaps we'll come back to that and draw upon some of those experiences through this session. As Amy touched upon, my area of work is in coach learning, coach education. That's what my PhD was about. And so when Jen and Amy approached me in 2020, mid-lockdown, to ask about contributing to their new book, it was a bit of a ray of sunshine. Obviously at the time, we were sort of locked down, working from home, working hard to try and sort of teach students, etc., all online. And so this was a bit of a welcome distraction from that. It was a chance to get my head around some writing, which I really enjoy doing. And as my area is sort of coach learning, coach education, there's loads of different myths or misunderstandings or misconceptions or things that bug me that I come across quite a lot that came to mind immediately. And I actually, in preparation for this, had a look at some of the files that I created when I first went about starting to write this. I created a file called the Emotional Graveyard, which is a bit of a tip if you want to write anything. It's a place to dump stuff that you write and then you're not, like, you don't want to keep that. Put it in the Emotional Graveyard, it can always be resurrected. But I had a look at the Emotional Graveyard and it has a lot of other myths or misconceptions that I kind of considered writing about as well. But as I started writing, this idea of learning styles really stood out as one that seems to be the most prevalent. It's one that people seem to identify with or come across quite a lot. And so it really seemed like the clearest one to really get stuck into. So that's sort of why I chose this idea of learning styles to write my chapter about. So as you can see on the slide, this idea of visual learners, auditory learners, and kinesthetic learners, that's just one type of learning styles inventory that you've probably come across in your time. Sometimes there's also sort of reading and writing in there as well, to make it, say, VARC learning styles. But there's actually about 70 different sort of taxonomies of learning styles you might have come across, and that's even one of the problems. Actually, sort of defining some of these things starts to become quite tricky. But we're going to focus on the visual, auditory, kinesthetic because it's probably the most popular and the one that you're most likely to come across. So just to explain it a little bit, this is the idea that certain people prefer to learn things and perhaps learn best by watching things. So you can see there's a little picture of our Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain watching a bit of football there. So he might be learning about football by visual learning in that picture. It's the idea that people might learn by listening. On the top left, you've got a picture of some rugby players, I believe, learning by listening to perhaps some of their teammates or another coach. And the idea that people learn by doing. So up in the top right, we've got some people playing a bit of ice hockey and they're learning by doing, by playing, taking part. And actually probably the thing that is most kind of, the thing that we were going to problematize a little bit today is this idea that as coaches or as coach developers, people that are coaching the coaches, as people that want to make learning happen, this idea that you should match your mode of instruction or your way of getting information across to the preferred style of the learner to help them learn better. So this would be the idea that if these players on the top left-hand corner are auditory learners, then they would learn best through listening. If these players on the top right-hand corner playing ice hockey are kinesthetic learners, they'd be learning best in this scenario here And if Boris Johnson is a visual learner, he's learning best by watching England play there. So this is the idea of learning styles. And it's actually it's quite prevalent. So let me just click on. In the UK, in particular, almost 2/3 of coaches, they believed this idea that individuals would learn better when they receive information in their preferred style. And this was some research done by Bailey and colleagues back in 2018, so it's still like fairly recent. And most of these people, most of the coaches that they surveyed came across these ideas on the core coaching courses that they were given by their national governing bodies. So it's pretty prevalent kind of myth. And indeed, as I said, my research area is to do with how coaches learn. And that's why I asked you to have a think about how you learned to coach. And in some of my research, I looked at the way that coach developers or coach educators, people that coach the coaches, how they were taught to do their job. And the training that those coaches went through, the coach developers they went through, that also featured things like learning styles and other different popular learning myths. So, you know, it's a tricky job. If you're a coach developer, you know that it's not a straightforward job. And you know that probably when you start to think about how you learn to do that, it's actually very complex. When you think about what you do when you're coaching, very complex. You might think about when you started out, it's not an easy task. And so this kind of idea of learning styles, it really helps us to kind of simplify that. It's a very intuitive idea, and that's what makes it so kind of pervasive and so attractive almost, because you know learning is quite bewildering, and being in charge of someone else's learning even more bewildering. So if you can kind of distill that down into 3 easy kind of styles, then that's, you know, it's a very attractive idea. So that's part of the reason why it's so kind of prevalent, really. And previously, we did another kind of webinar, and I stole the kind of phrase of it being a bit of a zombie concept from my old PhD supervisor, Professor Chris Cushion. It's a bit of a zombie concept because no matter how much you think that you've sort of killed it, it always comes back again. It always reappears. So it's pretty stubborn kind of concept. And when I started to read around the idea of learning styles even more in kind of researching this chapter, I actually came across some pretty problematic origins as well, which made it even made me like them even less. So have a look at the chapter if you haven't already, and if you can follow up on some of the references there if you're interested in that. So it's pretty prevalent in sports coaching. But when you start to think about, you know, how did you learn to coach? How did you learn to do what you do perhaps as a coach developer? You'll probably start to realize that any of these situations, they have a kind of mix of lots of different things going on. So actually it becomes a little bit problematic to just be able to split it into sort of neat categories of visual learning, or, auditory learning and kinesthetic learning. So for example, this situation, we're all here in this webinar. You're hopefully listening to what I'm saying, so that's auditory. But there's also a bit of visual going on too. We've got some slides, you're probably able to see me as well. So there's lots of stuff going on. And you could even argue, you know, I've asked you to think about how you learned. That's kind of reflection. You're sort of doing something there. You know, you're not doing coaching, but you're thinking. You know, that's quite, you could think of that as a learning by doing as well. And another sort of way to think about it is, I love cake. I quite like dogs as well, so that's why I got this picture. But I couldn't just eat cake all the time. That would not be very healthy for me. So I do need a mix of different things, just like a balanced diet. You kind of need a bit of a balance in any kind of learning situation. Because a bit of a problem with really buying into this meshing hypothesis, which is the idea that we should mesh or match the way that we get information across with the way that learners prefer to learn. And the problem with sort of buying into that is that you might think, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner, don't really like learning any other way. And so you're almost shutting yourself down from learning in any other way. So something like this webinar, you might not engage with. So there might be lots of people here lots of people who are not here because they think, oh, well, I prefer to be out there doing coaching to learn how to coach. Don't really need to sit and listen to a webinar. And they might be missing out on some pretty useful information that would be helpful for their coaching career. So just like this lovely golden retriever, it couldn't just eat cake all the time. I couldn't just eat cake all the time. We need a bit of a balanced diet. There's actually some evidence that if we always match up people with their preference, match up the way that they consume information with their preference, then it can actually harm learning. Because if we're kind of pushed to be a little bit uncomfortable, sometimes that's a good thing. It can help us to almost be forced to rearrange our understanding, make us kind of challenge what we know, make us rebuild a new understanding. So there's a bit of evidence that even if we kind of contradict that meshing hypothesis, then that could be a good thing. And basically in the chapter, once I kind of explain some of the prevalence of this kind of learning styles inventory in sport coaching, but particularly coach education settings, we sort of ask, are learning styles actually a myth, and is this a problem? And I have to say that this is referenced from Paul Kirshner, who's he was part of an author team that wrote a great book called Urban Myths About Learning and Education, which was also very influential for me when I wrote this chapter as well. So check it out if you're interested in finding out more about this and other myths. Basically, their answer is a resounding yes. It is a myth and it is a bit of a problem. And this is based on loads of really thorough reviews. So people that have reviewed all of the different literature out there, and they've kind of found that there's actually no evidence that matching up the mode of instruction with the preferences of the learner has any impact on the learning. So if we go back to this previous slide, some of these reviews talk about the type of evidence that we would need to be able to show that learning styles are worth sort of using in our practice. And so basically what you would need is some kind of experiment where perhaps you had a big group of coaches, maybe coaches sort of on their first coaching course, they're learning how to take their first steps into coaching. And we would need to split them into groups. And so we would have one group that are delivered the information in a visual way, one group that are delivered the information in an auditory way by hearing, another group that are delivered in a kind of kinesthetic way, so they sort of learn by doing, and then they all get tested the same way. And those people who are in a group that matched up with their learning preference, you would expect them to do better in the test at the end. And so any kind of, well, first of all, there's no studies that actually have done that in sport, sport coaching certainly. And secondly, any studies that have done that in other domains have not found any evidence that that's the case. So basically, there's hardly any evidence to back up this idea of matching the mode of delivery. So yeah, it's not looking too good for learning styles. But I suppose as might become a bit clearer throughout all the different webinars on this series, the best myths always have a bit of a grain of truth to them. And that's what makes them such good myths. That's what makes them such zombie concepts that are difficult to get rid of. And there is evidence for a few other things that will help learning. And the point is here that we should be focusing, especially in sport when there's limited resources, we should be focusing those resources on things that actually have some evidence to underpin them. So there's this idea of dual coding, which is something you might have come across, where the information is put across in two different ways at the same time. And that's shown to help people to remember that better. So here, what you're doing just now is an example of dual coding, because we've got some information up on the slide, you can look at it visually, and I'm also talking it through. So hopefully that should make it a little bit easier to remember. But again, we don't have loads of information or evidence for that in sport. So sort of remembering information that's sort of given to you is perhaps a little bit different from kind of motor skill. So again, it's an area that we don't really know loads about in terms of the evidence. Another kind of little bit that I talk about in the chapter is to do with these kind of VARC inventories, so the way that you kind of measure someone's learning preference. So people do have a learning preference, and that's fine. But I don't know if you've ever kind of done this. It's another little practical task if you like to, if you've ever got a preference for learning by doing, kinesthetic learning, then you can go and search for the VARC athlete inventory test. So some scholars have actually come up with a kind of inventory where you can go online and answer a few questions, and then it's magic. You get told what your learning preference is. But some of the kind of items for that are meant to be sport specific. They ask athletes to choose how they would give a new athlete directions to the training complex by drawing a map, which is said to represent a visual learner, telling them the directions, which is said to represent an auditory learner, writing them down, which is read or write, or by going with them to the destination, which is kinesthetic learning. So even as a coach, you're starting to think, I'm not really sure how useful that information is going to be. If you're basically asking people to rate that, and then in the end they get a report kind of spit out that tells you you're this type of learner, and then you're expected to kind of bring about learning based on that. So it's an interesting task if you've got a spare sort of 10 minutes or so to answer a few questions and see what comes out. But as I said before, knowing your preference doesn't necessarily help you, because you could be actually better off learning with a variety or a balanced diet of different ways of learning, and challenging yourself to learn in different ways is actually probably going to be a bit more powerful in terms of your learning. So what should we do instead? So I'm not necessarily in the business of just saying it's absolutely rubbish. Quite often a question that we get asked in return is, so what do we do? And I think that we should be, again, focusing on using some techniques or using some strategies or using an understanding of learning that's actually based on evidence. Because, we're in sport, we're all in the business of kind of in being more effective. If we can be better, if we know better, we can be better, so we should be trying our best to be better and use some things that have got a little bit of evidence behind them. So dual coding was one kind of aspect. It's a very cognitive kind of aspect of how people might learn that could be worth considering. But another kind of thing to think about is just thinking about the topic that you're trying to get across, and perhaps tailoring the way that you get that across to the topic, or thinking of lots of different ways you could get the same information across, so that lots of different preferences are kind of catered to but also challenged. Or if we're thinking about coaches learning, there's a few things out there that are based on a little bit of evidence, where we're starting to understand how coaches learn, which is again why I asked you at the start, how have you learned to coach? We could be starting to sort of build into our practice. So more recently, there's been a lot more kind of emphasis in coach education, coach learning, on just allowing coaches to learn how to learn. So this is an example of a filter process that I came up with through my PhD. So my PhD research followed football coaches, soccer coaches in the UK over a period of time, and looked at what they learned and how they learned from a formal coach education course, compared with a group of coaches who were matched but not going through this formal coach education course. And I used the data which came from sort of videos of their practice, interviews, using those videos, so it was based on what they actually did, to come up with a theory. So this theory is it's grounded in the evidence on how the coaches learned. And the theory talks about the process of learning. And part of it I've redesigned here like a coffee filter. So bear with me while I explain where I'm going with this. So it's a bit of a metaphor. But basically what I found was these coaches, they learned not necessarily through a particular learning style, but they all learned based on their biography. So their past experiences, the baggage that they bring to any situation, that was acting almost like a filter. It was filtering out different things that they were coming across, be that in a visual way, sort of through a webinar, or in a kinesthetic way through sort of practicing coaching, or even an auditory way, maybe listening to a podcast. All of those things, it didn't necessarily matter how they were getting across to the coaches. What's more important is it's getting filtered out based on their biography, who they are as a coach. So, for example, if you think of different things that have affected you in your life, we've got, not quite sure, nearly 80 people in this webinar. All of us are individuals. We've all got different backgrounds. We come from all around the world, all different sports, and all of those things will influence who we are and how we kind of interpret situations and what we take. So we're all going to end this webinar having learned different things. Hopefully you'll learn something, but it's probably going to be different from the person that joined the webinar after you or before you, because you're different people. So if we think of this coffee filter, down the side is almost like your biography. So that's your baggage. And the coaches in my research, they were kind of talking to me through these video stimulated recall interviews, talking to me about how on, say, a coach education course, they came across something and that might match with their biography. So it might be something that they already know about, something that they already do, something they already believe in, perhaps some kind of activity that they love to use. It's their favorite thing to use in training. That matches their biography and that goes straight through the filter into their coffee cup, ready for them to try out in practice or just reinforcing what they already know. On the other hand, if we look at the kind of right-hand side or the edges of the coffee filter, there were some things that they came across on a course that really contradicted their biography or their background. And so they would just reject that outright and just think, well, that's completely not what I believe in. It's, I don't agree with that, so I'm just not going to bother with that new piece of information. And then kind of in the middle of that, there was this idea of things that they came across that maybe fitted in with their biography. So things that would permeate through that biographical filter into their coffee cup, ready for them to be able to try that out in practice. And that was how they kind of made their new practical knowledge through a next step of trying stuff out, kind of reflective practice, maybe adapting it, adopting it, and trying again. So what the research shows actually, if coaches can be a little bit more kind of aware of how they learn, maybe using things that are actually based on evidence and data, then that's going to be a bit more helpful for them in learning in the future, rather than just buying into slightly more simplified, intuitive, but fundamentally not helpful myths like learning styles. So there's, I think, the paper that this is kind of based on, I think Jen's got the link for that if you want to have a look at it. If you're fancying a bit of a more academic read, then go for that. There's also, if you'd rather have something a little bit more accessible, a kind of learning tool that's based on that academic paper where I wrote up this series, so you can have a look at that. Jen's also putting that in the chat, I believe. So if we can, as coaches, start to focus more on things that are actually based on evidence, and that's hopefully going to make us a little bit more effective. But also, like, that's going to involve a little bit of embracing complexity. Like learning, as I said before, it's not an easy thing. There's no one definition of learning. It's based on how you believe the world works and what you believe counts as knowledge. And that makes it a tricky concept. But I believe as coaches, we shouldn't be dumbing down stuff like learning styles kind of can do, because it's easy to just buy into the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, easy peasy, and I'll just kind of stick all of my practice based on that. You could be missing out on some really great learning for your athletes, some really great learning for yourself, just by kind of oversimplifying something that's a bit complex. And really, as coaches, we could be buying into things that are, going to help us excel our practice as coaches and just be better. So I don't know if that was about 25 minutes, but that is my chat. And I wonder if we've got any questions that we can start to answer.
Brilliant, Anna. Thanks so much for doing that. We'll give people a couple of minutes to process. I know there's a couple of people after popping some things in there. What I think we'll bring Amy back in as well when you're ready, Amy. I'd love to just discuss briefly. I mean, we've been on a couple of webinars talking about this topic, and the numbers there tonight and some of the comments that are put in, excuse me, in the box show us that it's still very prevalent. Like Sam and Marianne talk about it today, daily, that they're hearing about this. Mark's put in last week, we have a number of different people which have kindly and with openness shared that their governing body still have it as a key focus of awards or syllabus that then their educators are delivering. So I think it's really important that we get a chance to share that. If that is happening, let's try and unpick that a little bit today, and let's share, because there's a number of people either in the background that are listening that have come across it, or maybe don't know how to handle that difficult conversation, be it an up managing one, or if they're delivering, so we can learn from each other with the large numbers that we have here, as well as your expertise, Anna. I think there's an interesting part. I mean, I'm in that group as well, in the sense that about 8-9 months ago, I'm in the middle of a webinar supporting an NGB, and we're having discussions with some of the kind of higher of the pathway coaches, and somebody starts talking confidently about learning styles and says it's on one of their formal quals. And I kind of pause, because I'm waiting for the representative who's invited me on to kind of say, eek, before I politely jump in. And he does, to be fair, and says, listen, we've taken that off a couple of years ago. I thought the interesting part that it's not really a question, Anna, but more a point of discussion, is that person has still taught it's on. So 2 years ago they've done, or 3 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, have gone through a path of level 1, 2, or whatever it is, the 4. And it was covered there, and now it's gone, but there hasn't been something other than their responsibility and their own professional development to fill that gap. And in this instance, in the sport that was in the room, you had coaches who were delivering on a daily basis, thinking, oh gosh, I've got to connect to their, give them more kinesthetic opportunities, because that's the way they learn, and have it this way and that way, and all different ways for them to learn and connect. So how do you think that if there are people who are either in a coaching role, a head coaching role, a manager's job, an NGB representative, if they're in the position where it is a focus, a big question for you, but how can we, I guess I do have a question, how can we start to support people to have those difficult conversations, besides taking the link to this webinar and just secretly dropping it in an inbox? What do you think?
I just send them a copy of your book, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. This red middle number.
Good question, thanks. There's an interesting comment in that the other book that I talked about, the Urban Myths About Learning and Education. They've got a chapter at the end of their book about how to challenge kind of those urban myths, and they actually even talk about, with the zombie concept, one of the problems with challenging these myths is that they actually can become even stronger, because you keep talking about them and they keep going even more. So yeah, they're stubborn concepts. I think there's a couple of things to remember. In the Bailey and colleagues study, they talk about how the sort of neuromyths are much more likely to be bought into by people that are actually really interested in the brain and psychology, and people that are interested in how people learn. So the kind of prevalence of them and people's engagement in them actually comes from a really good place. And so that's something to hold on to. So it shows that people are interested in how people learn. And as coaches, in sort of the past sort of decade plus, there's been much more of a shift towards that thinking or understanding of coaching, which is great. So learning is at the center. So that's a good thing. So take the positives there. Another positive is that learning styles does allow us, it does give us a language to talk about learning. So it allows people to think about how they're putting across things so that learners can learn. So that's also a good thing. And I suppose perhaps people that are in the online room probably have better experiences than me at actually challenging these. We've probably got loads of good experiences that we could draw upon in how to challenge these things. But I would say one way is that just to point out that there's no evidence for them. So, you know, all sporting contexts pretty much don't have, you know, they don't have endless resources. So we should be putting resources into something that has some evidence behind it. So that would be my way of challenging it. What do you think? Have you challenged it, Jen, yourself, or?
Well, yeah, and I said I was going to give you some breathing space, and there I went straight into another question. I'm sorry about that. I get very carried away, and privileged to have you in the room having this type of discussion. I do now have the confidence to challenge it, and have probably in the last number of years, because I took it upon myself to make sure I had evidence and I had on the ground experience. I was having rich conversations. I was trying to understand where people were coming from, instead of going, no, we're not doing it anymore. It's scratched, it's gone. There is a couple of comments in the chat box that we'll get to in a second, and I'll let you get to those. So yeah, there is a polite way, a timely way to do it, and trying to understand why it still exists in the places that it does, why it's still a focus, and not just, as you've alluded to already, not going with the what, having a little bit of the why, and then supporting the how on how to change that and maneuver, and kind of give some of the suggestions, which I would take an excerpt from your chapter. But while Anna's having a quick look at the chat box to look at some of those questions, Amy, where in your world, is it coming up regularly? Is it as daily and weekly, or monthly, as some people are putting down?
So for me, working in academia, it was part of kind of our curriculum, I guess, of what we taught. But this was kind of 8 years ago. And I think since kind of Richard Bailey's work, and he's kind of debunked learning styles, I think we did kind of go, okay, hang on a minute. It is more about kind of the individual, the biography, who they are. If we think about the concept of kind of adult learning and andragogy, it's about considering, like, if we're working with adults, considering their history, kind of their motivations, that kind of thing. But like, I must admit, it is something that I have taught in the past. I've given out the VAC inventory, we've got students to fill it in, and then we've used the whiteboard to get for visual learners and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely something that I've fully been kind of believed in myself as a coach and an academic. So and like Anna said, it's easy. And I think that's why it is so kind of prevalent. But Jenna, there's a nice question from Harry in the chat, and also I'd like to ask some of the canoeing and orienteering people in the room kind of their thoughts, because like that's something that still seems very prevalent within their coach education kind of program. So it'd be good to get some input from them. Anna, I don't know if you want to answer Harry's question first, and then we'll jump onto that.
Sure. First of all, I'll just talk to what you're saying about the inventory, but that's actually a really good kind of teaching strategy, though, because you can get people to fill it in and then just get them to think, how relevant is this to what it's actually like when you're learning? Like those examples from the athlete version, like, is that learning? Like, how would you introduce a new athlete to the training complex? Your answer to that, how is that going to help you understand your learning better, or their learning better? It's not like a unworthwhile thing to do. It's just maybe starting to question, why we're doing it, or its relevance in the context we're working in, rather than just taking it for granted.
Sorry, Anna.
Which question was it?
So Harry's asked,
yes. Yeah.
If optimizing learning to the participant is more about matching and connecting our delivery to their biography, what strategies would you suggest for designing sessions for athletes new to an environment? For example, first academy training session, what would your top tip be for optimizing learning for new players in a new environment over a short period of time?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I would point out that my area of expertise is more in coaches learning, not necessarily athletes learning. But I would say also, if you work in that context, then you're the expert there, not me. I would think about what it is that you're trying to get across to them, and which way of getting that across might be most effective. And that's not necessarily going to be the same for each individual. So you're speaking, if it's like an individual athlete that's joining their first session rather than the first session for everyone, then that's going to be different as well. So I think, yeah, just understanding a bit of, you said about their biography, to be able to match to their biography or to be able to work to their biography, you're going to have to understand a little bit about what that is. So what is their background and what's their starting point, so you can kind of pitch whatever you're trying to get across to them at a level that's, you know, good for them. So I know that's quite a vague answer, but you're the expert in your context. So, you know, it's about sort of trying things out as well. There's lots of different ways, no one right way to do it. So trying different things out and putting things across in different ways, and then sort of reflecting on it and seeing, did that work? Can I adjust that? And then that's going to be different for different individuals, and that's part of the skill of the coach. That's why coaching is so complex. There's no one right answer for each individual as well. So sorry if that's not a top tip that's very satisfying to take away, which is another thing that annoys me. There's no takeaways.
We will not be doing takeaways. We will not be doing takeaways.
A balanced diet.
Just to follow up on that, Jen, sorry, Margaret's made a really good point about kind of, she works in it with individual athletes, and she knows that they all learn in different ways, but she's never actually asked them. She says we never actually ask them when they enter our squad what works best for them, and I think that's a really good point. Margaret asks if other coaches in the room, you know, do we ask our athletes kind of what works for them, or do you wait to discover that and then correct it? So yeah, that's just a question for the group really from Margaret, but I think that's a really nice point that she's made there.
Yeah, also worth bearing in mind though, that once you know what they think is best for them and what they are comfortable with, actually sometimes that's not always best for them, in that sometimes it is good to put people out of their comfort zone a little bit. So with coaches learning in my research, there was some examples of things that coaches came across, say on a coaching course, that really contradicted what they knew and believed before. So an example was in football or soccer, a game with 4 goals, so one in each corner of the pitch. And the coach educators there were saying, you know, you only play football with 2 goals, you don't play the 4 goals, so anything with more than 2 goals is unrealistic to the game, don't bother doing it. And you could see the coaches in the room kind of being like, oh my God, like, I love that game, it's amazing. And I've got interview data from coaches who were saying, oh yeah, I didn't really agree with that 4 goals game is really great for this, this and this. So they just rejected what was being put across on the course due to their biography. But if they'd been so they were challenged, they felt uncomfortable, right? But if then in that situation, the coach developer had perhaps just asked them, you know, what do you think of that? Then they could have opened up a dialogue and started to say, well, have you thought about it in this way? Perhaps you could make it more realistic by this, this, and this, or why do you want to use that 4-goal game? We would use it in this situation or that situation, and why? So you can see that already, like a much more detailed kind of understanding could be developed there, but it's just a missed opportunity. So yeah, if we do sort of take the time to go a bit beneath the surface and challenge and, you know, push people out of their comfort zone a little bit, then that can be a good thing for their learning as well.
Thanks, Anna. I think that's looping in a couple of the great points and questions that are coming into the chat box there. And I know it's quite hard, you know, even attending a webinar when I want to look at the great stuff that's happening in the chat box, and yet I'm listening at the same time. So mindful that I'll try and cover that, but we will gather some questions that come from this and maybe put those in at the end of the edited presentation, or we'll put it somewhere for people to have an extension, because we do like the idea of sharing as much as we can. I think there's an interesting one from David Fraser there, if you could have a look at that. So I don't know if you can see it there, but I'll
read it.
What's that?
Yeah, I've read it.
You've read it, wicked, ready to jump in. Okay, thoughts on that? Because I have seen it, looking actually at when we did a webinar there a couple of months ago. So somebody had shared with me that it was on a prospectus for a university course, or for as part of a module. And I wondered, is there a blurred line? Is there clarity that we can have if this word comes up, or preferences comes up in style? So it'd be great to get your insight on. Yeah,
so people do have preferences. There is sort of, you know, there's evidence for that. that's fine. Like, I have a preference for cake, but it doesn't mean that I should eat cake all the time. um, so it's similar to Mark's kind of made a point about the obsession with personalized learning, and that we need to sort of differentiate for every individual's needs. Does that contribute to the myth's existence? Yeah, I mean, I have read things that talk about how, people love to feel like individual and different, like they're being catered for, because they have those preferences. So yeah, all of this does feed into the myth. So yes, people have preferences, and that's fine. We can cater to those preferences, and they might feel happy, and that's good. But we can also bear in mind that perhaps challenging them a little bit could help them to learn better. Perhaps it's about getting that balance, isn't it? So if you're happy and feel like you're being sort of catered to and stuff, and you might be more likely to learn something, but also you might need to be challenged a little bit as well. So it just depends on the context and the individual, and you can see how it gets more and more complex, and that's why learning styles is so sort of appealing, because it breaks down that complexity into something simple, gives us a chance to reflect on it and talk about it, which is a good thing, but we should do better.
And it's also just to kind of supplement it there, as I was thinking about this during the week, opportunities for people to go, there's a large volume of information now. Okay, tick, I've learned that, I got it. And I can use that, and that becomes a tool in the toolkit. But that phrase also can be misleading, because if we don't take out those rusty tools, or we do use them and they are rusty, and I think there's an interesting part there, is lots of people supporting on how they are managing those conversations, integrating, which is great, is understanding why we're using it. And as a couple of people have commented there, ask the athletes, have conversations. And we do default sometimes to these glossy questionnaires and surveys. I know people are under time constraints, etc. And it's sometimes easier to have that as a little interim kind of conversation, fill this out and then we'll have a conversation. But actually getting to the crux of, how do you like to be coached? What was your experience? You thinking about it as a coach, asking the people in front of you, and kind of understanding the bigger picture can be really good, can't it? So I love that people have shared a lot of that there. That's great. Okay, so there's another one there, just because I think there's a whole heap. It's 53. I want people to be at the gap by 8 o'clock, but I've shared one there with you to have a look at. But in the meantime, while Anna kind of takes a little bit of a break, what other opportunities do you have other than asking the athlete? So Anna shared a few, there's a couple in the chat box. Just take 30 seconds there. If it is coming or has been coming up in your environment for a while, and you want to connect with your athletes a little bit more, it's a thread that goes the whole way through the book in all the chapters. The person, who they are, what's going on, why are you there, why are they there? Can you just share some ways that you have connected with the people that you're working with? Now that can be, coach to coach, in some cases coach to athlete, and you can help us look at that while Anna has a quick catch up, because there's a few great questions that have come through there. So as people are answering those and thinking about those, that'd be great.
So I think you had two lined up for me to answer.
Yes, please, take which one you like.
So the one about the context of what is being learned.
Yeah, that's an early question that I thought we'd go back to once we get into the meat of it. Yeah, from Jen.
Yeah, that was so hard. There's like basically no evidence to go on sort of difference between learning a movement versus a sort of strategy or like a game plan or statistics. In terms of learning styles, there's nothing on that. So it's another reason why we can't necessarily say coaches should buy into or use learning styles, because there's no evidence on like using them for sort of movement skills. And I'd say it's probably down to the coach with their group of athletes and individuals to sort of try different things, see what happens, and just keep sort of reflecting on that. Maybe again, in my own research, I kind of found that coaches were quite not very explicit about how they tell if something that they try out works or not. They were just like, yeah, that works, I'll keep doing it, or no, it didn't work, so I'm just going to ditch that. Whereas someone else somewhere in the chat talked about being open-minded, and that's a pretty useful skill as a coach. Being open-minded enough to think, oh, I can maybe tweak that or adapt it, try in a different way and try again. So it's sort of similar to there's like a practitioner kind of section in this chapter where I got one of our former students who is also an active football coach. For one of his modules, he had to do like a kind of placement style, almost like research your own practice. And that's kind of a worthwhile thing to do. So rather than necessarily trying to trawl for evidence that might not necessarily be relevant to your coaching context, why not look for evidence within your own coaching context? So do almost like your own experimentation. So again, in my research, I found that that's how coaches learned new information. They actually, once they'd come across that, filtered it out, it was then a kind of experimentation process that also matched up with some other research by Gilbert and Trudell. Way back in 2001, they found that sort of effective youth coaches, they learn through their experiences by experimenting, tweaking, sort of reappreciating and trying again. So that would be kind of that would be my response to that one. It was quite a tricky one to answer. And then what was the other one?
Yeah, no, I'll jump in because I'm mindful of time, but there's a lot there. And we won't get to everything, and I don't want to hold people up. We will probably linger for a few minutes after the bulk of people leave if people have any pressing questions. But before we talk about the next session, just first of all, a big thank you to you, Amy, for getting this book moving together. A massive thank you, Anna, to you for coming here tonight and to get us in a space where the bones of 81 people tonight who are facing this, whether it's a year ago, monthly, daily, whatever it is, in their space, have an opportunity to just look at the chat box, learn from each other, share a little bit, ask some questions, go and linger and think about what's happening in their environment and who's there. There was a question early on with the Magic Academy up nice and high up here about what 2 skills would you, if you gift every coach 2 coaching skills, what would they be? If I was to give you 2 quick fires there, Anna, would that be putting you on the spot too much?
There would definitely be one about kind of open-mindedness, or at least a sort of willingness to try things, and perhaps understanding how they learn. So that's 2, because
amazing. Thank you.
It doesn't necessarily matter if you don't have any of those other skills, because then with open-mindedness and a willingness to try and understanding how you learn, then you can learn new skills.
Wicked, brilliant, look at that. So Amy's going to tell us about the next session. Joe and a couple of other people have started to share their email address, which is 100% brilliant if people are open to doing that, and we'll keep the connections going. There is obviously a part 2 coming out of the book if people have gone through it already. We do hope you pick and drop and share the chapters and the richness over the next 19 months with us until next November. But in the meantime, if there are any myths that you flick through those 20 chapters and think to yourself, why haven't they put this in? Definitely share that with us. Pop it in the chat box here. Yeah, come to us on Twitter and let us know, and we will source the wonderful people of the world to help us, just like Anna has tonight. So a big thank you. Amy, what's up next month, or who's up next month?
Yeah, so next month we've got the excellent Diane Culver from Canada. She's going to talk to us about communities practice. And Diane will be joined by her co-authors, Don Vincent and Tiago Duarte. So Diane's going to not talk about just one myth. It's kind of multiple misconceptions around the communities of practice, how they've maybe been misinterpreted, and hopefully she'll really be able to kind of outline, what is a community of practice and how can we use them most effectively. So yeah, 27th of April. Everyone who signed up tonight was sent a link, but please keep an eye out on Twitter because the advert, the Eventbrite link will be going out. So what we'll do at the end of every webinar, we'll release next month's link to sign up. Yeah, so look, hopefully see everyone there, and thanks Anna, and thanks to you, Jen, as well.
Brilliant, thanks everybody. Have a lovely rest of evening, safe trip, or sleeping if you're at the other side of the world, and we will see you next month.
Cheers everyone, great chats.